Hello everyone, welcome to Marco's BL Love. Please enjoy this video.
The botanical garden is warm and green and quiet, and the man standing 6 feet away is the one I drove away from at 6 in the morning with a hospital bag in my hand, and contractions tearing through me while he laughed on the phone in the next room. He is looking at my son. My son with the black hair and the dark eyes and the particular stillness that is not mine at all. He is looking at Saurin and understanding everything without me saying a single word, and the weight of that understanding is crossing the warm, humid air between us like something physical. He says, "I know what I did." And the worst part, the part that terrifies me most, is that I believe him. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. My name is Caspian Wren. And I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I did not fall apart in that hallway. I did not drop the bag. I did not cry. I stood very still, the way a person goes still when the ground beneath them has already given way, and they simply have not fallen yet, because the body sometimes needs a second to catch up with what the heart already knows. I heard the laugh again through the closed bedroom door, low and easy, the laugh of a man telling a funny story to someone he trusted more than the person sleeping in his bed. And then I picked up my keys, walked out the front door, and drove myself to the hospital alone. But that was 3 years ago. And this story, the real story, does not start in that hallway. It starts 2 years before that night, on an evening when I was still young enough to believe that love and belonging were the same thing. I was 24 when I met Dorian Voss. I was working the closing shift at a small print studio downtown, the kind of place that made wedding invitations and gallery programs and smelled permanently of ink and warm paper. I liked the work because it asked nothing of my secondary nature. At the studio, I was just Caspian, the designer with the steady hands and the eye for spacing, not the Omega who had been told since adolescence that his purpose was primarily biological. My designation had never sat lightly on me. I was a blonde Omega in a city full of alphas who thought blonde meant soft, meant yielding, meant grateful for whatever attention was offered. I had spent years building a version of myself that was quietly impenetrable, and I was proud of it. Dorian walked in 20 minutes before closing. He was the kind of man rooms noticed without him doing anything to cause it. Black hair, not styled, but simply there, falling at an angle across his forehead that suggested he had pushed it back sometime in the last hour and not thought about it since. Jaw, like something carved with patience. Dark eyes that moved across the studio samples on the wall with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for things people actually cared about. He smelled of cold air and cedar, and something underneath both of those things that I would later learn was his natural alpha scent. Dry and deep the way old libraries smell, warm without being sweet. He needed a program printed for a gallery opening. His photographer friend's first solo show, he explained. And he had left the ordering until the last possible moment, because he had been traveling for work. He was matter-of-fact about the lateness without being apologetic in that performative way that irritated me. He simply stated the situation and asked what was possible. I told him what was possible. He listened, which sounds like a small thing but is not. Most alphas I had dealt with in that studio listened to the first sentence and then began negotiating from a place of already having decided what they wanted. Dorian listened to the whole explanation, asked one clarifying question, and said, "Whatever you recommend." I remember the phrase specifically, because no one had said it to me in that context before, at least no alpha had, and it caught me off guard in a way I concealed by turning back to my design screen immediately. We exchanged numbers for the order follow-up. He texted that same night to confirm the details and added, "For what it's worth, the layout you suggested sounds better than what I had in mind." I stared at that message for longer than I should have, and then replied with something professionally adequate and put my phone face down on the counter. He came back for the programs 2 days later. He also brought coffee, one for me, without asking what I took in it, which should have been presumptuous, but was not because somehow he had gotten it right. Black with 1 sugar, which is exactly what I would have ordered for myself. I asked him how he knew. He said he had noticed the coffee cup on my desk the first night still sitting the way people leave cups when they have drunk the whole thing, except 1 cold inch at the bottom, and cannot quite bring themselves to throw away what is left. 2 sugars and milk leave a different residue than 1 sugar black. He had paid attention to the residue on a stranger's coffee cup. I found that both strange and devastating. That was the beginning. We saw each other 4 more times before he asked me to dinner, and each time felt like a conversation that had been interrupted rather than started fresh. He remembered things I had said, not in a calculated way, but in the way of someone whose attention is genuinely present. He was an architectural consultant, which explained the traveling, the practiced eye, the way he oriented himself in spaces as if calculating their proportions. He had grown up in the north of the country, in a city I had never visited, and he described it with the affection of someone who had left willingly, but not without love. He was an S-class alpha. I learned this not from him, but from a colleague of his who came into the studio once for an unrelated print job and happened to mention Dorian's name in passing, and then mentioned his designation the way people mention well-known facts, with the mild surprise of someone assuming others already knew. S-class alphas were rare enough that knowing one was considered a kind of social credential in certain circles. Their rut cycles were stronger and less predictable than standard alphas, their pheromones more potent, their instincts more pronounced. They also, statistically, bonded less frequently because the intensity of the connection they were capable of made most potential partners nervous before anything real could begin. I did not tell Dorian I knew. I waited to see if he would tell me himself. He did, on our 3rd dinner, without being asked, without dramatic preamble, in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything. He said he wanted me to know before things went further, because it changed the practical nature of certain conversations, particularly around how rut cycles were managed and whether a partner felt equipped for that level of intensity. He said he had learned from experience that discovering it later always felt like a concealment, even when it was not intended as one. I appreciated that. I told him I already knew. He raised an eyebrow, and for the first time I saw him genuinely surprised, and something about surprising him felt like a small private victory I intended to savor. We were together officially for 2 months before his first rut while we were a couple. I had been with one other alpha before Dorian, a brief and largely unremarkable relationship in my early 20s with a B-class who had made me feel peripheral even when I was in the same room, and so I had no real frame of reference for what an S-class rut actually felt like from the inside of it. It was not what I expected, not the loss of control I had been told to anticipate. Dorian's ruts were intense in the way of deep water, not violent but immersive, a kind of gravity that pulled at both of us without cruelty. Afterward he was quieter than usual, not cold, simply thoughtful in the way of someone who has said more than words during a particular experience and is taking time to mean it. He held me, the morning after, with the full weight of his presence. No perfunctory comfort, no immediate return to ordinary distance, just his arms and his warmth, and the slow cedar smell of him coming back to its usual register after the heightened sharpness of the rut. I thought I understood what we were. I thought the understanding was mutual. I moved in with him 8 months after we met. His apartment was large and dark in the way of spaces that have been designed for function and have slowly accumulated warmth from being lived in. He had books everywhere, not arranged decoratively, but stacked the way books accumulate when someone actually reads them. Flat surfaces claimed by whatever was currently in progress. He made room for my things, without fuss, cleared half the wardrobe, cleared a section of the studio shelving for the design files I worked on at home, brought home a second monitor for the desk without being asked because he had noticed I was squinting at my laptop screen. I loved him. I want to be clear about this because it matters to what comes later. I loved him thoroughly, without reservation, in a way that felt like a choice made newly every morning rather than an obligation I was maintaining. I loved the specific quality of his attention. I loved the way he looked at the city from windows, like he was always half calculating what could be made better. I loved that he was genuinely interested in my opinion on things, and genuinely changed his position when my reasoning was better than his. I loved the particular silence of being in the same room with him when neither of us needed to speak. For a year and a half, I believed that what I felt was what existed between us. The evidence supported it. He was present, consistent, warm in his contained way. He came home when he said he would come home. He remembered small things. He touched me, with the care of someone who understood that touch carried meaning beyond its physical component. Then the rut cycles began to change. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift you feel before you can name it. His ruts came more frequently, which was not unusual for S-class alphas in their late 20s. The body recalibrating to the presence of a settled partner. But something in his manner around them changed. He seemed tighter beforehand, less inclined to the gradual closeness that had preceded them in the early months, more likely to be absorbed in his phone in the hours leading up to onset. After, he recovered faster, was already moving toward his phone before I had properly come back to myself. Small things, the kind of things that could mean nothing. I noticed. I did not say anything. I told myself I was being the kind of person who invents problems in good situations because good situations feel precarious, and that this was a personal flaw I should manage internally, rather than project onto a relationship that by every visible measure was functioning well. And then I became pregnant. I was not trying to become pregnant. We'll say we had spoken about children in the abstract, favorably but without urgency, the way people speak about things they want in their future when the future still feels spacious. Omega male pregnancy was rare enough that I had not been taking the precautions I probably should have, and my heat the previous month had been milder than expected, which I had attributed to stress rather than the actual reason. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon at a clinic 2 blocks from the studio. The nurse who told me was matter-of-fact and kind, and gave me a small informational packet that I carried home on the train without opening, holding it flat across my lap the entire ride because somehow flattening it with my hands made the information inside feel more manageable. I did not tell Dorian immediately. I needed 48 hours with the fact before I could share it, which is not unusual for me. I process things in private first and present them after I have located my own position on them. I was frightened. I will not pretend otherwise. But underneath the fear was something that surprised me with its warmth. I wanted the child. I had not known that about myself until the moment it was real, and then I knew it completely. I told Dorian on a Thursday evening. I cooked dinner, which I later recognized as a way of creating a context of normalcy around an abnormal announcement, the way people set scenes when they are about to say something that will change the scene entirely. I waited until we had eaten, and then I told him, clearly and without drama, while we were still at the table. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I began to recalibrate my expectations of his response. Then he said, "We need to talk about what we want this to mean," which is a sentence that sounds reasonable in isolation. We do need to talk about what we want things to mean. But the we in that sentence and the this and the mean all felt, in their arrangement, like they were doing work he was not prepared to name outright, and something cold moved through me that I swallowed before it showed on my face. We talked. He was careful, measured, not unkind. He said he was surprised, which was fair. He said he needed time to process, which was also fair. He said he was not sure the timing was right, which began to be less fair. He said he wanted us to think carefully before making any decisions. I told him I had already thought carefully and that I intended to continue the pregnancy. He said he understood. The conversation ended without resolution, in the way of conversations that are really about something else underneath. Over the following weeks, he was present, but differently present. The specific quality of his attention had shifted. He was courteous, concerned in a functional way, accompanied me to the first medical appointment without being asked. But the warmth that had been consistent for a year and a half was now occasional rather than constant, and I was aware of its absences the way you are aware of a sound that has stopped when you realize the silence is not restful, but simply empty. His rut came 6 weeks after I told him. I was 11 weeks pregnant, tired in the deep cellular way of early pregnancy, and I came to his rut the way I always had, with full presence and without reservation, because that had always been how it was between us. Afterward, lying in the particular stillness of that particular darkness, I heard his breathing settle into the pattern of a man who is awake but choosing silence, and something in me that I had been managing carefully for weeks loosened in the wrong direction. "Dorian," I said quietly, "are we all right?" He did not answer immediately, and in the space of that pause I learned something about the architecture of what we had built together and where the weight was not being held. "We are what we are," he said finally, which is an answer that means everything and nothing simultaneously, and which I have spent a long time since then understanding the cruelty of. I did not push further that night. I lay still beside him, and I breathed, and I put my hand over my stomach where our child was already becoming real, and I thought about the shape of the future. from this new angle, and I worked, as I always worked, to locate a position on it that I could stand in without collapsing. 3 more weeks passed. His rut came again early, which was unusual. S-class cycles did not typically stack so close together, and afterward he was on his phone within 20 minutes, which had become the new normal, and I was lying awake in the way I had become accustomed to lying awake when his phone screen lit up the ceiling at angles. The following night I woke at 2 in the morning with a low cramping that resolved itself, but left me unsettled enough to sit up for an hour and drink water and breathe slowly and think about calling my doctor in the morning. I mentioned it to Dorian over breakfast. He nodded and said I should definitely call if it happened again, and then he checked his phone, and I watched him check his phone, and something in me quietly made a decision it had been approaching for some time. I started paying attention differently after that, not snooping. I want to be clear about the distinction. I was not looking for evidence of anything specific. I was simply paying attention to the details I had been managing not to see, and the details assembled themselves into a shape that was not ambiguous. He was in contact with someone regularly. The contact happened at particular hours, late evening, early morning, during rut cycles, and immediately after. His manner when the contact happened was not the manner of professional correspondence or casual friendship. The phone was angled away from me. Conversations ended when I entered rooms. He was protective of the device in the particular way of someone who is protecting something rather than simply maintaining privacy. I said nothing. I continued going to work, continued attending prenatal appointments alone because he had begun to find reasons why a particular appointment was difficult for his schedule, continued cooking dinner and sleeping in our bed and growing our child, and continued being the version of myself that functions well regardless of what is happening internally, which has always been my most reliable skill and my most exhausting one. I was 18 weeks pregnant when the night in the hallway happened. I had woken at 6 in the morning with early contractions, which the doctor had told me could occur at this stage and were not necessarily alarming, but should be monitored, and if they reached regular intervals, I should come in. By 7, they were 6 minutes apart, and I had packed the hospital bag I had been assembling for 2 weeks in the particular organized way of someone who prepares for things they are afraid of, by making the preparation as thorough as possible. Dorian was awake in the bedroom. I could hear him, and I had the bag in my hand, and I was walking down the hallway to tell him we needed to go. The door was not fully closed. His voice was clear and easy and unhurried. He was talking to someone who made him sound like the version of himself I had fallen in love with, loose and warm and present in the way he had stopped being present with me. And then I heard him say it. Caspian is just my rut toy. I keep him around for heat season. He doesn't even know it. And then the laughter. His laughter, which I had loved, which I had catalogued and carried the way you carry the particular sounds of someone who belongs to you, turned into something I didn't recognize. I stood in the hallway with my hospital bag in my hand, and the contractions coming at 6-minute intervals, and I made the only decision available to me that did not involve becoming the kind of person I had never intended to be. I left. The drive to the hospital was quiet. I had always been a careful driver, even under stress, which is the kind of detail that says something true about a person. I parked in the emergency bay and walked through the entrance alone and told the intake nurse my name and my situation, and she put me in a room and hooked monitors to my abdomen, and the sound of my child's heartbeat filled the space where everything else had just emptied out. Fast and strong and absolutely unconcerned with the disaster I had just walked out of. The contractions were diagnosed as preterm labor, manageable with medication and rest, not requiring immediate delivery. The attending physician was calm and thorough and told me I would need to remain for observation overnight. He asked if there was someone to call. I told him I would handle it. He did not press. I lay in that hospital room overnight, and I did not call Dorian. My phone showed 3 missed calls from him by 9 in the morning. I did not call back. I called my oldest friend instead. Her name was Fen, short for Fenwick, which was a family name she carried with the tolerant exasperation of someone who had made peace with an inherited absurdity. She arrived within 40 minutes, sat down beside my bed, looked at me with the particular focus of someone who already knows something serious has happened and is waiting for the shape of it, and said, "Tell me everything." So I told her everything. The whole of it, the long arc from the print studio to the hallway, the phone call, the laughter, the words. Fen listened without interrupting, which required real discipline, because she was by nature an interrupter. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you need?" Not, "What are you going to do?" Not, "How could he?" Not, "I knew something was off." Simply, "What do you need?" "I need to leave," I said, "with the baby. I need somewhere to go, and I need it not to be anywhere he would think to look." Fen had a sister in the east of the city, Rook, who had a second apartment that was currently between tenants. Within 24 hours of my discharge from the hospital, I was in that apartment. Small, clean, high up enough that the city made a different kind of sound than I was used to. The windows faced east. I had brought 3 bags and my work laptop and the prenatal vitamins lined up on the kitchen counter of Dorian's apartment, which I took because I had bought them, and also because they were necessary. Dorian called 14 times over the 2 days following my discharge. He sent messages. The first several were variations of, "Where are you?" Then they shifted to, "We need to talk." Then they became longer and less composed in ways that might have moved me in a different version of this story. I read them all. I responded to none. I had a child to prepare for. I had a life to dismantle and reconstruct. I had work to do. I did not let myself feel the full weight of what had happened for approximately 6 weeks, because 6 weeks was how long it took to stabilize the practical structure of an independent life to the point where there was room for feeling. I found a new clinic, transferred my prenatal care, informed the studio I would be working remote for the remainder of the pregnancy, updated my lease agreement with Fen's sister to a proper month-to-month arrangement, opened a separate bank account, and spent 4 evenings methodically removing Dorian's name from every shared document and subscription I could locate. On the 43rd day of being gone, I sat on the floor of the east-facing apartment at 11 at night with a bowl of soup going cold beside me, and I cried for approximately 2 hours with the specific sustained quality of crying that has been held back for long enough to become structural. It was not elegant, it was not brief, it was necessary. After that, I was able to move forward. My son was born in the spring. I named him Saurin, which means stern or severe in the old northern language, which felt right for a child who had announced himself in the middle of a hallway crisis and arrived exactly on his own schedule, regardless of anyone else's. He was born at 7 in the morning with black hair already thick enough to curl slightly at the temples, which hit me somewhere deep and complicated that I chose not to examine immediately, and eyes that were unfocused at birth the way all newborn eyes are, but which opened on the world with an expression of profound assessment that made the delivering nurse laugh and say, "This one is going to be a handful." He was not a handful. He was the most specific and coherent person I had ever met from approximately the first week. He had opinions about things. He communicated these opinions with remarkable efficiency for a creature with no language. He liked the window. He liked silence, and disliked abrupt sound. He liked being carried facing outward so he could see what was happening, rather than facing into my chest, which the book said was unusual for infants his age, and which I found completely predictable given everything I knew about his circumstances of origin. I loved him in a way that rearranged the entire interior of my chest to accommodate the size of it. Fen was there for the birth and for the first bewildering weeks. She brought food and spelled me through the nights when the exhaustion became mathematical rather than merely physical, and she held Saurin with the careful amazement of someone encountering something newly important. Her sister Rook made the apartment officially mine at a rate that I was certain was below market, and which I chose not to argue, because some kindnesses are better received than interrogated. Time passed in the particular way of time when a small person is structuring it. Months became a year. Saurin learned to hold his head up, and then to sit, and then to stand gripping the edge of the sofa with the focused determination of someone approaching a physical problem that requires concentration. He said his first word at 11 months, which was light, in reference to the east windows, which were his favorite feature of every morning. I rebuilt. This is the part of the story that does not get told as often as the parts with crises in them, but it is the part I want you to understand because it is the part that made everything that came after possible. I rebuilt my practice, took on larger clients, hired a part-time assistant, built the studio from a side business into a real one. I moved us into a larger apartment in the same neighborhood when Saurin was 18 months old, still east-facing, still high up. With a small second room I painted the color of morning fog. I made friends, not many, but real ones. I found a rhythm with Saurin that was not the frantic rhythm of early parenthood, but the settled rhythm of two people who have figured out how to live well together. I did not hear from Dorian for 2 years. Then his name appeared in my messages on a Tuesday morning, and I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time before I deleted it without reading it. Then another message a week later. I deleted that one too. Then silence for 8 months, and I thought perhaps that was the end. Saurin was 2 years and 4 months old on the afternoon everything changed again. I had taken him to the indoor botanical garden on the east side of the city, which had become a Saturday ritual since he developed an intense interest in the way light came through glass ceilings. He walked beside me now, which still felt miraculous to me, the way walking always feels miraculous in the early period of it, small hand in mine, black hair catching the greenhouse warmth, already composing observations about things he noticed in that quiet interior voice that was becoming distinctly his own. We had stopped beside a display of pale winter orchids, and Saurin was performing his characteristic sustained examination of a thing that interested him, crouching low to look at the base of the largest one, when I became aware of a presence at my peripheral left. The particular quality of the awareness, before I processed it consciously, was one I recognized from memory rather than from present information. Something in my body knew before my mind did. I turned. He was standing 6 feet away, still in his dark coat, black hair longer than I remembered, looking at me with an expression I had no category for, because it contained more information than I was prepared to receive in a botanical garden on a Saturday afternoon, with my son crouching at my feet. Dorian Voss had found us. I did not move. I did not speak. Saurin, with the unerring instinct of young children for the exact worst moment, chose that particular second to stand up and turn around, and he looked at the tall, dark-haired man standing very still, 6 feet from his father, with the same focused assessment he brought to winter orchids, and then he looked up at me with a question forming in his expression that I was absolutely not ready to answer. The air in the botanical garden was warm and humid and smelled of green things growing, and I was standing in it, with my past and my present occupying the same physical space for the first time, and the only thing I was certain of was that I was not the same person who had stood in a hallway with a hospital bag and heard herself described as a convenience. I had built something real in the years between that night and this afternoon. I had built it alone, which is a particular kind of proof. Whatever came next, I would not be undone by it. But I had not anticipated how much it would cost to stand still and wait for it. Saurin looked at Dorian the way he looked at everything that required understanding. Quietly, with that particular stillness he had been born with, as if the world were a document he was reading at his own pace. Then he looked back up at me. His hand tightened around mine, not from fear, because I had come to know the texture of Saurin's fear, and this was not it. It was more like the grip of someone who wants to know where you are before deciding whether to move. I looked at Dorian. 3 years is long enough to expect a person to look different, and short enough that they mostly do not. He was the same, perhaps a shade more worn around the eyes, the particular wearing of someone who has not been sleeping as well as he once did, but the same black hair, the same quality of absolute stillness when he was processing something, the same cedar scent crossing the 6 feet of warm botanical air between us and reaching me before I was ready for it. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Saurin. Something moved across his face that I had no desire to name. "Hello, Caspian," he said finally. His voice was the same too. I did not return the greeting. I picked Saurin up, which I had not done in 3 months because he was at the stage of preferring to walk everywhere under his own authority, and he allowed it with the cooperative gravity of a child who understands when something adult is happening even before he has the language for it. "How did you find us?" I said. "The design studio," he said. "Your work has been in the City Quarterly for the last 6 months. The credits were yours. I hired someone to trace the studio registration." He paused. "I am not saying that to frighten you. I am saying it because I owe you honesty about the method, and I am trying to demonstrate that I understand the difference between the two." I stared at him. After 3 years of silence on my end, after the deleted messages, after choosing invisibility as thoroughly as my work allowed, he had gone around the thing I had built between us and found the edge of it anyway. I was not surprised. I had known, in the part of myself that was always doing the quiet calculation, that a man like Dorian would eventually locate whatever he was looking for. What surprised me was that it had taken this long, and what that delay said about whatever had needed to resolve itself in him before he could come. "I would like to talk," he said. "Not now, not here. Whenever you are willing and wherever you choose. I will come to you." "I am not willing today," I said. He nodded. He looked at Saurin one more time, and I watched him absorb everything that looking at Saurin communicated. The black hair, the particular angle of the jaw, the dark eyes that were mine in expression but his in color. I watched him understand what he was looking at without me having to say a single word. His face did not collapse. He was not the kind of person whose face collapsed in public, but something in his posture shifted in the manner of a load that has just been redistributed and the body is adjusting to the new weight. He took a card from his coat pocket and placed it on the edge of the orchid display shelf, not offering it to me directly, simply making it available. Then he said, "I know what I did. I am not here to dispute it or excuse it. I am here because there are things you deserve to know and things I should have said a long time ago." Then he walked away. Through the warm green air of the botanical garden, he passed the glass ceiling with its afternoon light, out through the east entrance, and gone. Saurin watched him go. Then he looked at the card on the shelf, and then at me. "Who is that?" he asked. "Someone I used to know," I said, which was true and insufficient, and the best I could manage in that moment. I left the card on the shelf. We went home. I made dinner. I bathed Saurin and read him the book about the lighthouse keeper he had been requesting every night for 3 weeks, and sat beside his bed until his breathing settled into the slow, even rhythm of actual sleep. Then I went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a long time, with the overhead light off, and the city coming through the window in its ambient sodium glow, and I thought about the card I had not taken. I thought about the thing he had said. "I know what I did." Not I can explain, or I was going through something, or you misunderstood. I know what I did. It was the most specific thing he had said to me in the last year we were together, which was a damning comparison, and which I recognized as meaningful without knowing yet what to do with it. I called Fen at 10:30. She picked up on the second ring the way she always did, as if she existed in a state of perpetual availability to the people she loved, which was the most reliable thing about her. "He found us," I said. "I know," she said, which startled me. "He called me 2 weeks ago. I didn't tell him anything. But I also didn't tell you because I wasn't sure whether to, and I have been arguing with myself about that decision ever since." There was a silence. "He told me he knew what he did," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He called me because he wanted to know if you were safe. That was all he asked. Not where you were, not how to find you, just whether you and the baby were safe." I absorbed that. "The baby," she had said, because when he called, she would not yet have known about Saurin, about who Saurin was, about the specific weight his existence added to everything. "He saw Saurin today," I said. "He understands." Another silence, longer this time. Then Fen said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I'm working on it." That was how it began. Not with a decision, but with the recognition that something had entered the situation that was too significant to manage by simply maintaining distance. Saurin was Dorian's son. Dorian knew. Those two facts together had a gravity I could not pretend did not exist, not because of what I owed Dorian. I owed him very little, but because of what Saurin might one day need to understand about himself and where he came from. I did not contact Dorian for 11 days. I spent those 11 days watching Saurin with a new kind of attention, not the vigilant love I always brought to watching him, but something more specific. I watched him at the window with his morning light. I watched him with the wooden blocks he arranged into structures more architecturally coherent than you would expect from a 2-year-old. I watched him stop in the middle of eating to observe a bird on the windowsill with the stillness of someone making a genuine study of a thing. I thought about what I wanted for him. I thought about the kind of childhood I could give him alone, and the kind of understanding he would eventually require of the parts of himself I had not given him. On the 12th day, I sent a message to the number on the card. Not the card from the orchid shelf. I had not taken that one. I had his number still, from 3 years ago, unchanged. I said, "Saurin's birthday is in 6 weeks. Before then, I will meet you once. You will tell me everything you said you owed me. After that, I will decide what happens next." He replied within 4 minutes. Yes, wherever and whenever you choose. We met at a coffee place near my studio, neutral ground, public enough that the architecture of the interaction would remain controlled. I arrived 7 minutes early, which is my standard margin for managing the anxiety of uncertain situations, doorperson, and I sat facing the door. He arrived exactly on time, which was also characteristic, and he did not bring flowers or gifts or any of the objects people sometimes use to perform contrition because they cannot manage the plain version of it. He brought himself, in his dark coat, and he sat down across from me and ordered coffee and waited for me to begin. I said, "I am not here to forgive you. I am here to hear what you have to say and to make informed decisions about my son's future. Saurin is your biological child. That is a fact I cannot manage around indefinitely. But the terms of any relationship between you and him are mine to set, not yours. Do you understand that?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Then talk." And he did. He told me things I had not known. He told me about Rafferty, the name he had never spoken in the 2 years we were together, the alpha he had been involved with for 3 years before he met me, the one the phone calls were always for, the one his rut cycles had been tangled with long enough that unwinding it was a slower and uglier process than Dorian had anticipated. He told me that what he and Rafferty had was not love, had not been love for the last 18 months of it, but that it was the kind of entanglement that does not release cleanly because it has its hooks in things you have not examined clearly enough to understand you need to remove them. He told me that the night I had overheard him, the night with the laughter and the words that had unmade me, he had been on the phone with Rafferty, not as a confession of love, but as a cruelty deployed in the specific way of people who use the diminishment of a new person to reassure the old one that the old one still has power. He had said those words because Rafferty had been threatening to contact me, to tell me the shape of what was still unfinished between them, and Dorian had been trying to neutralize the threat by making me sound inconsequential. It was calculated, he said, and the calculation was a betrayal of everything we were, regardless of whether Rafferty ever actually called. I sat with that for a moment. The particular horror of it was not that he had said those words in a moment of weakness or anger. It was that he had chosen them deliberately, as a tool, and the tool had been me, the reality of me, the actual weight of what I was to him stripped down and repurposed into a currency for managing someone else. "Did you love me?" I asked. I had not intended to ask that. It came out the way things come out when you have been not asking them for 3 years. "Yes," he said, without pause, without hedging. "Not the way I should have, and not without failing you in ways I should not have allowed myself to fail you. But yes." I looked at him across the table. The cedar smell of him was present in the way of things that are encoded in memory and reactivate on contact. I did not feel the old devastation looking at him. What I felt was more complicated and less consuming. The kind of feeling that comes when something that had enormous power over you has lost most of that power, not because you have become numb to it, but because you have grown large enough that it no longer fills the whole field. "You have a son," I said. "He is 2 years old and his name is Saurin. He has your hair and your eyes. He arranges blocks into load-bearing structures, and his first word was light. He is the most important thing I have ever done, and he is not a negotiation. If you want to know him, you will do it on his terms and on mine, and you will not mistake the opportunity for something you have a right to." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I understand, and I am grateful." We arranged a series of conversations over the following weeks, in which I assessed what Dorian was bringing to the situation and whether the bringing was consistent. This is the part that does not have drama in it. It is the part of serious decisions that consists of showing up repeatedly and behaving the same way each time until a pattern can be trusted. Dorian showed up. He was consistent. He was not performing consistency in the particular bright, anxious way of people who know they are being evaluated. He was simply the same each time, which is a different and more reliable thing. On the 5th meeting, he brought up the thing I had been waiting to see whether he would bring up. He said, "I know I have no standing to ask anything of you, but I would like the chance to know my son, and I would like, if you are ever willing, to find out what we might be to each other now, not to recover what we were. That was not good enough, and I know it. Something that could be better than what we were." I looked at him. The light in the coffee place was afternoon light, coming in at a low angle, and it caught in his black hair the same way it used to catch in the apartment windows. And I thought about the person I had been when I moved into that apartment, and the person I was now, and how much distance existed between those two positions, and whether any of it was crossable. I said, "I am not making any decisions about us today, but I will introduce you to Saurin. We will see how that goes first." His face did something I had not seen it do before, something genuine and unguarded and not at all composed. It lasted only a second before he recovered his usual expression, but I had seen it, and it told me more about what this cost him to sit across from me with patience and no guarantees than anything he had said in words. The introduction happened on a Tuesday afternoon at the Botanical Garden, which I chose deliberately, returning the location of our collision to something neutral and even pleasant. I told Saurin that morning that we were going to meet someone, a person who would like to get to know him. Saurin asked if it was the tall man from before. I said yes. He said, "Okay," and went back to his blocks. Dorian was there when we arrived, standing near the orchid display, coat off because it was warmer that week, and he saw Saurin walking toward him and went very still, in the way he went still when something mattered enormously and he was determining how to meet it properly. Saurin walked up to him and stopped at his feet and looked up and said, "Your hair is like mine." Dorian crouched down to Saurin's level, which was the right instinct, and said, "It is, exactly like yours." Saurin considered this for a moment. Then he said, "Do you like windows?" Dorian looked at me briefly, a question in his expression. I said nothing. He looked back at Saurin and said, "Yes, especially tall ones." Saurin nodded as if this confirmed something he had suspected. Then he said, "Follow me," and walked toward the glass ceiling section of the garden, and Dorian followed him, and I walked behind both of them, and something in my chest was doing something I chose not to examine too closely yet. They spent an hour in the Botanical Garden. Saurin showed Dorian the light effects he had been studying for months. The way the afternoon angle hit the far panels differently from the morning angle, the way certain glass panels had slight imperfections that made small prismatic breaks in otherwise even light. Dorian listened with the quality of attention that had made me fall in love with him at a print studio counter 3 years ago, genuine and unhurried, asking questions that were actually about what Saurin was saying rather than questions that were about performing interest. At one point, he identified the angle of light Saurin was describing as the result of the roof structure's overhang ratio, which was an architectural observation, and Saurin looked at him with the expression of someone who has just found out a secret language is shared. I sat on a bench nearby and watched them, and did not allow myself to feel everything I was feeling all at once, because that was not a manageable quantity, and I was in a botanical garden, and Saurin needed me to be functional. After that first meeting, Saurin asked about him. Not constantly, not with the particular ache of a child who is missing something, but with the steady curiosity of someone who has encountered a thing worth returning to. He asked what Dorian did for work, which I answered. He asked if Dorian knew about buildings, which I also answered. He asked if Dorian would come to the garden again, and I said I would ask. I asked. Dorian said yes, with a speed that suggested he had been hoping to be asked. The meetings at the Botanical Garden became a pattern. Then they became walks along the East River. Then they became an occasional Saturday afternoon that included lunch, the 3 of us at the table by the window, that Saurin always requested when we went to the noodle place 2 streets from our apartment. Saurin between us, in the literal spatial sense, while I worked out what the arrangement meant in the less literal one. Dorian was good with him. This was not something I had been certain of. Dorian was reserved in the way of people who love deeply but do not perform it, and I had not known how that quality would translate to a small child who had no use for reservation. What I discovered was that Saurin had even less use for performance, and that the quality of Dorian's attention, fully present and genuinely interested, was exactly the thing Saurin required. They understood each other in the particular wordless way of people whose interior structures are similar. I watched them, and felt the complicated thing, and continued choosing not to feel all of it at once. 6 months after the Botanical Garden, on a Thursday evening when Saurin had been put to bed, and I was washing up, and Dorian was still at the table, because staying late had become a thing that happened without formal arrangement, he said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. He said, "What would you need from me to trust this?" I stood at the sink with my back to him for a moment. Then I turned around. I need you to understand that I am not the same person you left, I said, not the same person who was in that apartment with you. I have been alone for 3 years, and I have built something real in those 3 years, and I do not need you to complete it. I need you to understand that before anything else, because I cannot be in something where I am providing more than I am receiving. I did that before, and I will not do it again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know, and I am not asking you to go back to that. I am asking what I would need to do to be worthy of what you have now. I looked at him across my kitchen, in the light of the lamp Saurin had picked out because it was the color of morning, and I thought about 3 years of building and the particular solidity of what I had constructed, and whether there was room in it for this, for him, for the ongoing project of deciding what we could be. You would need to show me, I said, not tell me. Show me. For as long as it takes. He nodded. I understand, he said, and I will. 3 months after that conversation, on a Sunday morning when the east light was doing the specific thing it did in March when the angle was shifting back toward warmth and the whole apartment felt like it was waking up. Saurin appeared in the doorway of the kitchen where I was making breakfast, and Dorian was reading at the table, which had also become a thing that happened without formal arrangement. And Saurin looked at them both and said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone announcing an obvious fact, "You should stay here." He was looking at Dorian. Dorian looked at me. His expression was careful and contained, and underneath it was the unguarded thing I had seen that afternoon in the coffee place. The thing that appeared when he was trying to be composed about something that cost him everything not to reach for immediately. I looked at Saurin. I looked at Dorian. I thought about the east windows, and the morning fog color of Saurin's bedroom, and the blocks in the corner of his room that had become their shared architecture project, and the 3 years I had spent learning the weight of my own life, and what it meant to carry it well. I thought about what it meant that being whole on your own was not the same as closing every door. I thought about what it meant that 2 people could have failed each other and grown separately and come back to the same table, knowing more about what they were capable of, both the damage and the repair. I thought about the specific quality of being seen by someone who was paying actual attention, which I had not let myself have again in 3 years because I had been protecting something that turned out to be stronger than I had given it credit for. Then I said, "The coffee is ready. Sit down." It was not a declaration. It was not a ceremony. It was a cup of coffee at the window table with the morning light doing its particular thing. The 3 of us in the same space without the architecture of visiting and leaving, just present, just there. Saurin climbed into his chair, reached for his juice cup, and looked out at the morning like a person entirely satisfied with the arrangement of his world. Dorian wrapped both hands around his coffee and looked at me across the rim, and I looked back, and outside the city was doing what it always did, moving and building and making its constant sound. And inside, the light was the color of the lamp Saurin had chosen, and everything was not resolved. Everything would require ongoing work. But we were in the same room in the morning, and that was where it started. Not with forgiveness handed over in one clean moment, not with the past erased or the wound pretended away, but with 2 people who had hurt each other and grown and come back to the same table choosing, in the full understanding of what choosing cost, to try at something better than what they had been. I had driven to the hospital alone. I had built a life alone. I had raised a son alone and watched him learn to say light as his first word and arrange the world into structures that held their own weight. And I had done all of that, not because I was waiting for something, but because I was living forward into the only thing any of us actually have, which is the next moment, and the one after that, and the quality of attention we bring to both. Dorian set his coffee down. Saurin was telling him something about the angle of the morning light, and how it was different in March than it was in February, and Dorian was listening the way he always listened, entirely and without performance, and I stood in my own kitchen in the life I had built and let myself feel all of it at once. It was a lot. It was exactly the right amount.